This is Ed Rep Radio, presented by Eastman Music Company. This is Ed Rep Radio, a podcast to bring you ideas and information from industry experts you can use on the road every day. Presented by Eastman Music Company, and I'm your host, Shane Duell. On this episode, we'll be talking about all things tubas with Chuck Kerrigan, low brass product manager for Eastman Music Company. Tubas are something that Ed Reps often work on with band directors on school purchases and carry them many times to and from your repair shops. This is also an instrument where there's a lot more to it than many band directors or even Ed Reps sometimes realize, and we're going to dig into useful information and advice about the different sizes, 3 versus 4 valves, piston versus rotor, and the best tubas for the different age groups, and a lot more. Chuck Kerrigan, thanks for joining us.
Hey Shane, thanks for having me.
So Chuck, before we dig into all this great information about tubas, I would love to hear how you started in music and eventually became the low brass product manager for Eastman.
Sure. I started out as a student of the tuba. I wanted to play professionally, and that was my goal. And when I was in high school, I just knew I was going to be the next tuba player in the New York Philharmonic or the Chicago Symphony. And that's the only thing I wanted to do from probably sophomore year in high school. So I went to school for tuba performance, and that took me to Arizona State University. I wanted to study with Sam Palafian. And so I followed him there when he left Boston and moved to Arizona and kind of stuck around for the weather. It's hard to leave here once you get here.
I hear it's very nice weather.
Yeah, it's 80 degrees today. It's beautiful. Sorry for those of you in other parts of the country. But while I was here, I started playing and working early on. My sophomore year in college, I started doing all the sub work with the Phoenix Symphony and playing with the opera, and had a brass quintet or two that was working, and started being able to make a living playing the tuba. And I just was lucky, I think, in that time frame to be around Sam Palafian when he was talking with Gerhard Meinl about tuba, and then when Sam left Meinl Weston and ended up at Besson first and then over at Jupiter, to be around while they were developing products and kind of watching what they were doing. And even before that, in New York, growing up, Dylan Music was cutting a lot of old B-flat to key of C because we were convinced the metal was better. And York only made 2 C tubas, and we were trying to recapture that. Watching all of that happen, I really had an interest in the manufacturing of tubas and watching how all of that happened and what the processes were. So fast forward a few years, I'm out of school, working, playing tuba, and I went to work for a music retailer. I went to work for a company called Milano Music, and started out part-time during rental season, as a lot of people do, to help them with the influx during rental season with rental nights and more customers in the store. And
how long ago was that, Chuck, that you started at Milano's?
2003 was the year I started there. And before that, I actually worked for a year for American Music, which was a company that turned into Music and Arts, was purchased by Guitar Center and Music and Arts when they bought them, but in a completely different role. And when I went to work at Milano's, I started working, like I said, for rental season. And then they saw that, wow, this person knows how to talk to professional musicians. And he can talk about all these instruments that we don't sell that many of. And so they kept me on, and I started working the sales floor, but very quickly became a road rep, because like in most businesses, that's where you're going to make money. So your best people end up out on the road because there's greater potential for income. So that's what kind of brought me into the industry. And from there, started building relationships with our manufacturers' reps, because I was very interested in the manufacturing process and what was being done. And Eastman at that time had a friend of mine working for him, and I reached out and said, hey, nobody's buying our tubas. And this is probably about 10 years ago at this point. And so I got samples of the tubas, and they were just bad. That's the reason no one was buying them. And we started consulting shortly thereafter and had some great successes with the EBB 234 and the EBB 534. And then that turned into some collaboration with other people on the EBC 632 and our EBE 853 E flat tuba. And from there, it just kept growing. And so little over 3 years ago now is when Ryan Richmond reached out and said, we need somebody to do this full time. What you've started with us has grown past the point of us being able to take care of it in-house and just using you as a consultant. And the timing was right, and I made the move.
And we're lucky to have you. I have to say, I've been with Eastman for 7 years, and it's been unbelievable to watch the growth of the tubas and the acceptance of them and the level of player that plays on them now. It's night and day. And I have to give you kudos for so much of the work you've done. And your knowledge in tubas is just astounding. And that's what we're talking about today. And to me, it's a fascinating topic because I'm a trumpet player. And I had... honestly, Chuck, before I met you, and we really launched into this whole tuba thing at Eastman, I knew the basics, but I had no idea. There were so many keys of tubas, so many different wraps of tubas. How many tubas have 3, 4, 5, 6 valves? And I'd like to have you start just at the basics, at the very beginning, literally the beginning of the history of the tuba and how it kind of branched from its early stages in the band to where it is now.
Well, Shane, in 1884, no, we're not going to go that route. The tuba has been around from the second half of the 1800s, so it's a relatively new instrument in the brass world. And the easy way to look at it is they came out of a family of instrument called tenor horns. And if you think of that, of instruments like any other instrument, there was a baritone, a tenor, a bass, an alto, and a soprano voice. And the instruments all looked pretty much similar to an upright bell euphonium. And that's kind of where it got its start, or one of its starts. And that would be the instruments that you ended up with in France and England. And they were piston valve instruments. And then a little bit before that, in Austria and Germany, they were inventing instruments that had rotary valves and looked a little bit more like a blown up ophicleide with valves on them. And they were rotary valve instruments. And for those of you that don't know, I'll save you the hassle of looking it up. An ophicleide looks like a big metal bassoon, but it's played with a brass mouthpiece. And that was one of the predecessors to the tuba.
And it hasn't stuck around in bands.
Unfortunately, it's making a comeback.
Is it really?
Yeah, one of our artists who plays tuba in the Met, they were doing Samson and Delilah a couple years ago, and the conductor said, hey, can the two of you guys playing tuba do this on ophicleide? It would be really great.
Wow.
Luckily, they didn't have to do it. But we, at that time, in the 1800s, our trade relationships were much better with England and France. So the instruments that we ended up here in the U.S. were piston valve instruments, so more of those piston valve bass tenor horns. And so they were upright valves, and they were in the key of B flat and E flat is where they were. And so that's kind of why, if you look at old school band books, they usually have two lines written. There's the top line for E flat tuba with E flat fingerings, and the lower line had B flat tuba fingerings written in for the lower bass line part.
So a little bit like the current British brass band style.
Exactly like the British brass band style. So that's where we started. And if you were in the Sousa band or in the Goldman band or any of the bands back in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the U.S., those were the instruments you were playing, or a sousaphone in the key of B flat and also in the key of E flat. So that's kind of where we started, and we developed a rich history of manufacturing here. Some manufacturers moved over to the States, others kind of started here. And we have, like, the York Instrument Company is a very famous tuba manufacturer, but the Kahn Company has been around forever, and the Holton Company, and providing great band instruments to start with. And at that point in time, they all had a wonderful line of tubas. And I think where you're going with this is tubas also have so many different sizes. And back then, there wasn't really a standard. And they had really wonderful names for their instruments, like the Jumbo and the Monster. And in Europe, it was the Kaiser model. And that designated how big an instrument was. And then we decided there needs to be some type of system of standards. And so tubas developed a sizing system similar to violins and cellos and basses, where they have fractional sizes to them. And that's kind of still what we use today, even though it's still a little bit imperfect. But back to the tuba's development, when people started moving from the band world being your place for professionals to play, and concert goers wanted to go and see orchestras more, and that became more of an avenue for professionals, tuba players started switching over to C tuba. And for whatever reason, the music written for orchestras, a lot of times the keys are better. They fit better on C tuba. A lot of times the trumpet players are playing on instruments in the key of C and C instruments. And so overtones are better. So there are a bunch of reasons that this happened. And so down the line, for many years, professional tuba players played C tubas and students played B flat tubas. And then your E flat tuba, and then the other key that we have are F tubas. Those were relegated as our high instruments, our more soloistic instruments. And, what started out in a beginning band program, like on an E flat tuba, that kind of went away. And everyone started playing B flat tubas. And the high horns became specialty horns for people that were going to be professionals.
Okay.
Yeah.
So getting it down to the nitty-gritty basics of a B flat, C, E flat, F tuba, sonically, I mean, you look at a B flat tuba and you'll have so many different wraps, but the tubing is all the same length, right?
Correct. Yeah, on a B flat tuba, it's the same length, and a C tuba is about 2 feet shorter than that. And similar difference between an E flat and an F tuba. And if you're familiar with, you're a trumpet player, so if anyone out there listening is familiar with trumpets, your C trumpet and B flat trumpets, they don't look very different, but when you listen to them, the C trumpet is a little bit brighter. It might project more because it has more highs in its overtones. It's usually easier to articulate on them too because there's physically less tubing. You have
a little more responsive. Is that the case in tubas?
It's the same with tubas, and that's one of the big reasons I think a lot of people switch to C tuba, especially as our roles changed. When you think about it, in the beginning, we were the band in a band, and then as we became a more soloistic instrument and brass quintets started to happen, we needed to match other instruments, and it's hard to tongue like a trumpet player on a tuba or an oboe player or a bassoon player, whoever you happen to be working with. And so with an instrument like a C tuba, it's a little bit easier than on B flat tubas in general. And I think if you look at E flat tuba to F tuba, it's kind of the same. Not quite as much of a difference because they're both smaller instruments with less tubing, but F tuba is got a smaller sound usually, and it has more color, a little easier to articulate than and responsive than an E flat tuba, where E flat tuba is generally an easy way to think about it. They sound like small B flat tubas. Yep.
Okay. So I guess if you're to lay them out, the B flats have the longest tubing. The C is a little shorter. The E flat's a little shorter. The F is a little shorter. And as you're changing to the shorter tubing, you're getting a little more responsive and you're getting a little brighter. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yep, that's correct.
All right. So let's look at just B flat tubas. That you said those are the school tuba key to use, correct?
That is correct.
But what is hard to wrap my mind around sometimes is how many different sizes and shapes there are of B flat tubas, even though they have the same length of tubing, they're in the same key, they have the same fundamental pitch, but they look completely different. Can you talk a little bit about what's different between a full size tuba, for example, and a 3/4 size tuba? What's changing?
Yeah, so there are two things that are changing. The bore size in the valve section is going to get larger the bigger the instrument generally, and then also the diameter of the tubing itself. It's not changing length, but it is growing. So if you're looking at a 6/4 tuba, let's say we're using in an orchestra or a large ensemble, large band, if you look at how that bell tapers and how big the bottom bow is, how fat it is, and then you compare that to a 3/4 B tuba that a student's going to start on, yeah, they might be the same length, but one is definitely much more compact. You might have a 14.5 or 15-inch bell flare versus a 20-inch bell flare. And the bore size might range from 660 or less even, 0.660 or less, which is in inches, to 0.750 or larger. And it doesn't seem like much, but when you consider that the difference between a medium large bore trumpet and a large bore trumpet is the thickness of a few strands of hair.
But you can feel it. It's amazing, that tiny difference.
Yep, it makes a big difference when you're doing that. And obviously, for the reason that you do that is the physical size of the instrument. You can't start kids at a young age on a gigantic instrument. And we also don't want to have a gigantic instrument playing in a small ensemble. Like one person playing a tuba can cover up a bunch of trumpets and horns and trombones just because of the size of the sound. So yeah, you want to, for balance purposes, we play different size instruments for what our job calls on. But for this conversation, you're starting kids on that 3/4 tuba because that's physically how big they are. They need to start on a smaller instrument or else they're not going to succeed, and then they end up quitting.
Yeah. So it's not just smaller in physical size, so they can just literally put it in their lap and hold it. The bore, the width of the tubing is smaller as well, right? So it's a little easier to play.
That's correct. Yeah, everything is smaller because their lung capacity is smaller. So the amount of air they can put through the instrument, the resistance is going to be greater. As professionals and adults, we think a lot of times as resistance being bad, but especially for young kids, resistance is needed. And even as professionals, there are places where you want resistance. It's a good thing. So those are things that we try to build into student level instruments to make it so that they progress better. It's kind of similar like a small bore tenor trombone that a student might start on versus a large bore tenor trombone like the members of the New York Philharmonic are playing.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. So basically, as the student gets bigger, their tuba is getting bigger with them. That physically, the bell's getting bigger, the bore is getting bigger, the sound's getting bigger.
That's correct.
Interesting. Okay. Let's take a moment and talk about 3-valve versus 4-valve. What is the difference and why is there a 4th valve? What's the point?
So we add a 4th valve to tubas. And what that does is it's a flat 1 in 3. So you're basically adding the length of tubing that is the 1st valve and the 3rd valve and just a little bit more to make it so that it's in tune. And then what that also does is now it gives you the ability to pull that 4th valve slide as you continue to go down chromatically, because with that extra valve, you can chromatically extend your range lower. So your 1 and 3 combination is in tune valve 4. Your 1, 2, and 3 combination, 2 and 4 is not quite in tune, but if you pull the 4th valve slide a little bit, it certainly is. There is no half step below that on a 3-valve tuba. But on a 4-valve instrument, you can pull the 4th or 1st valve slide and play that low E flat now in tune, and then so on, compensate until you get down to low B on a B flat tuba. A 4-valve instrument, you still can't play a low B. There's not enough tubing that you can physically pull while you're playing and kind of make it happen.
Okay. So just to reiterate, the 4th valve is basically like playing 1 in 3, but a little lower, so it's in tune. And if you press down the 2nd valve in the 4th valve, it's basically like playing 1, 2, and 3, but it's lower and more in tune. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think,
all right.
But just to give you an idea of how out of tune a tuba is with itself, playing 4 brings 1 and 3 in tune, but when you push 2 and 4 down, which is the same as 1, 2, and 3, it's still sharp. That note you still have to pull tubing to make in tune.
Yeah. All the more important to make those slides nice and slick and move easily,
correct. Right? Just not so
easy
that they fall out when you rest the tuba on the bell.
Sticking with this question of valves, is you hear all the time the question is, what should I get, a piston tuba or a rotor tuba? What do you think, Chuck?
For me, it's an easy question. You get both, and
you get a quiver of tubas.
Yeah, and I'm not kidding. I play piston C tubas. That's my main instrument, whether I'm playing in a brass quintet or solo literature on a 4/4 size instrument, or if I'm in an orchestra or a band playing on a 6/4 instrument. I play piston instruments, and for me, it's because number one, they are easier to maintain, but they're also it seems cleaner for me. It's a more nimble than having rotary valves. It's for whatever reason, the instruments that I've grown up with and played, that's kind of it. But also the sound concept that I grew up listening to, those people for the most part were playing big tubas, were playing piston C tubas. And so that's the sound that was in my head. And so that's what I've wanted. Now on the flip side, when I go to my high tubas, I play rotary F tuba. And I like the sound and the color of the rotary F tuba more so than a piston F tuba. For me, a piston F tuba just sounds like a really small C tuba, and I'm not getting the change of color that I might want when I'm playing on a high tuba.
Okay.
So, but now when you're going between big tubas, if you're in a high school band program or a middle school program, and you're going, do I get a piston B flat tuba or a rotary B flat tuba? And we generally break that up into, well, one is very Germanic sounding with the rotary valves, and one is an American sounding instrument with piston valves. And so it becomes a color choice. And that's literally what leads it. Like I will play rotary B flat tuba if I'm trying to get that Germanic sound, because the big piston C tuba doesn't give that to me. But in a band program, a lot of it is just what that band director wants, what the sound in their head is for the band program. Is it that American tuba sound? Is it a German tuba sound? Go ahead.
So you're describing American sound and German sound, and it's hard to use words, I know, to describe tone and things, but try to use words to describe German versus American sound, piston being the American and rotor being the German.
Yeah, piston tubas, and the American sound in my head is this. It's kind of a big, warm sound that has articulations and fronts on it, and it's kind of just nice. It's there. It's a pretty sound, and I think
It's pretty.
Yeah, and I think with the German sound, man, you have a ton of color in there, and sometimes it's not always pretty. It gets a little bright, a little edgy, but they can make it broad as well. And I think a lot of this is because of the way our instruments, the bells taper. On American tuba, bells tend to taper really quickly. So if you look at where the bell hits the bottom bow and where the bell flare ends up, it's this more like flower pot kind of flare. On German tubas, we kind of call them stovepipes, where it gets big, but it's much, much more gradual. And that allows that color change and giving them all of the colors that they have. And for me, I love the way that B-flat rotary tuba sound with the trombone section. But again, I grew up with that American sound, that crisp, clear, warm kind of sound. Now, there are going to be people that hear me say that and they're going to be like, well, I don't hear it that way. Everyone has their own perceptions, I think. When it comes to the nitty gritty on this, I always try high schools to buy piston instruments just because of ease of maintenance. So unless...
Why do you say that? What goes wrong with a rotor that wouldn't be as appropriate for a school?
So once you're adding the linkages, you think of all of the moving parts on the linkage. You have the paddle itself, which a lot of times is connected to multiple rods, bearings on them. And those bearings wear out over time if you don't take care of them properly, and then they get really noisy. They also have material that are called bumpers that when the valve is pushed down, the valve is not going up and down in the case, it's rotating. So it has to have a place to stop and start so that everything is aligned properly on a rotary valve. So you have these rubber or cork bumpers that wear out, and if they're not really well taken care of, crack and fall out at the most inopportune times. And so for me, and add to the fact that on a piston valve instrument, you can literally unscrew the top, pull it out, put oil on it, take the bottom cap off, remove the spring and swab it out and clean it. Your average high school kid that you trust can do that. A band director can definitely take care of that maintenance. When you want to take out a rotary valve, well, now you're taking the linkage, you're detaching the linkage, you're putting the screw back into the stop arm, you're taking the bottom cap off, then you take a mallet and you bang the screw on the stop arm, pop the plate on the bottom off, and then you unscrew the top again so that you can pull the valve out. So there's a lot more technical know-how that goes into maintaining and cleaning rotary valve instruments.
Right. And plus, the tuba sit over the summer in a super hot band room. And it seems like both pistons, I've seen as an ad rep, both pistons and rotors get stuck, but it seems like rotors are much more difficult to get moving.
Yeah, they are. And I think a part of that is, too, that they're the same material. You're looking at brass on brass. Like your rotor material is made out of its brass, and the rotor casings are brass. And so when you're rubbing like materials together, it's easier to get friction. And with friction, you can catch. And so when that oil dries out over the summer, it's really easy for brass on brass to catch like that. Whereas on a piston valve instrument, whether it's a trumpet or a tuba, it's either a Monel or stainless steel, or in the old days, nickel. You have a different material on the valve itself. And so there's a lot less friction, and therefore, I'm not going to say it won't stick, but there's less likelihood comparatively. And so that also would transfer over to your French horns.
Now, speaking of materials, what are generally, at least with the Eastman line, and I guess throughout tuba history, what kind of brass are we using?
Well, so a brass is going to be a combination of copper and zinc, and it doesn't matter what you call the brass. That's kind of what it's going to be. So standard brass today is called yellow brass, and that's 70% copper and 30% zinc. And it's one thing we should probably throw out there, because being a manufacturer that makes things in China, a lot of people go, well, where do you guys get your brass? Is it inferior? No, 70-30 brass is 70-30 brass no matter where you get it. It's that compound. It's copper and it's zinc and it's the same. The difference between things is how it's treated when it's manufactured. That's another story. But brass is brass. It's 70-30, and that's the alloy most people use for their instruments. When you start hearing things like a gold brass bell, well, it looks redder. You can see it. There's more gold to it. So there's more copper in it. So now we're upping that ante to 85% copper and just 15% zinc. And what that'll do, the more copper makes the instrument a little bit warmer, darker sounding. And so that's one of the advantages of that. But it also, might reach its max output volume sooner. We call it like it might hit the wall faster than a yellow brass instrument. It might be slightly harder to articulate cleanly. So the bigger the instrument is, that would make a difference. And then even from there are people that make what we call rose brass or red brass bells. And those are 90% copper, 10% zinc, and everything in between. We make tuba bells out of 80-20, which back in the 30s and 40s was actually called low brass. And that's the brass that manufacturers made tubas and euphoniums out of. And then there's people called German brass, which was, I believe, 78% copper, 22% zinc. So there's all of those ranges, but 70-30 is the most standard.
Okay. Do we make anything with a different alloy other than the yellow brass? In tubas?
Yeah, we do. Not in our student level product, but once you get up into our 800 series instruments, you can get our big tubas and our 4-quarter C tuba, our 800 series instruments, and our rotary valve F tubas as well that have that 80-20 material. And then if you cross brands and you end up at Shires, they make trombone bells with tons of different materials, and you'll see, I think, 4 or 5 different alloys. Yeah,
it's a myriad of options there in the trombone world. So let's talk a little bit about what goes on top of the brass. Once the instrument's made, you see raw brass where there's literally nothing. You see silver, you see lacquer. How does this change the instrument itself, or does it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because there were people that will answer that differently. I believe it makes a big difference. A lot of people will tell you it's in your head, but scientifically, it changes the sound. And so here's what ends up happening. As you silver plate brass, let's say, you're putting lacquer on instruments, you're changing the surface tension of that material of the brass. So with the silver plate, you're literally forming a chemical bond to the brass with the silver. And there's usually copper in between, because silver sticks better to copper. So you have that bond there, and silver brings out more high overtones. And so as humans, we perceive highs as being louder. So when you're in the hall listening to somebody play, I've done this a bunch, a silver-plated tuba, even if it's being played at the same decibel as a lacquered or an unlacquered instrument, will sound louder in the hall. We will perceive it to be more present. And that's because of the high overtones. So when you lacquer it, you're also changing it, and you're increasing the high overtones a little bit, but just not quite as much. When you have an instrument that's raw brass and it's completely unlacquered, it actually, in the hall, the perception is that it doesn't project as much as the other ones, which is the exact opposite feeling that you get as a player. Because when you don't have that lacquer, which is like a coating of paint, or that silver plating on there, the instrument vibrates more in your hands. And so it feels like it resonates more. But when you actually get out in the hall, that's not the perception.
That is interesting. And if you look around a lot of, say, our artists who are playing on Eastman tubas, what are they playing on? Is it lacquer, silver, raw brass?
Most of them are playing silver on their big instruments, so on their C tubas. And that's also a very American thing. I think that's one of the other differences in sound going back between that German and American sound. German instruments, whether they're professional or student, tend to be lacquer for the most part. And so our F tubas, most people are playing our lacquered F tubas because that's the color and the sound that they want. They want it to be a little bit warmer and have more control over that.
Okay.
And then for students, we use a different type of lacquer. It's more of an epoxy lacquer. And so we do that for durability purposes.
Okay. That's interesting. Let's go deeper into that a little bit. So we have epoxy lacquer for student products. And what's the other one? What other kind of lacquer
we use
do we have?
nitrocellulose lacquer, which is similar to what we use on some of our string instruments. And that's a lacquer that's going to allow that instrument to ring more. So it'll dampen the vibrations a little bit less. So you get an instrument that responds and plays better, but that finish isn't quite as durable. So if you're somebody whose system is acidic, you're probably going to eat through our lacquer faster than you would some other manufacturers, and it's done on purpose. It's because we want that overall sound of the instrument to be better. But now when you're talking about an instrument that's in a school, and they might purchase a tuba that has to last them 20 plus years with however many students playing it at the same time, in and out of case, not wiping fingerprints off, you want that to be durable. So you use the more durable lacquer.
Yeah. Is one lacquer, I suppose it would be the epoxy lacquer, is one more resistant to multiple chemical baths in repair shops over the years?
Yeah, that one actually, I can't tell you from certainty whether one is more resistant to chemical baths. I think the problems that happen with the baths is that if you do get a break in the lacquer where it comes off, all of that surrounding area where that exposed brass is, there's places for that acid to get in. And so from that point, it doesn't matter whether you have an epoxy lacquer or a nitrocellulose lacquer, or even if it's silver plate where you're worn down. Once you can get underneath and you have that wear pattern, and when you put it in chemicals, it does start breaking it down more.
Okay, good to know. So outside of the instruments, there's something I think any brass player would agree is really important. That's the mouthpiece. What do you recommend size-wise and shape-wise, I guess, through these various kinds of tubas we're talking about in the age ranges?
Sure. So I think with tubas, there's a couple of very good generalizations to follow. For shapes of the cup itself, we have a funnel shape and we have a bowl shape. And that's pretty self-explanatory what they are. It starts, funnel is bigger at the top and kind of gets that gradual funnel shape towards the bottom, where on a bowl shape, the cup sides might come down straighter and then just round out towards the bottom like a bowl. And then when you go to rims, you're going to have rims that are flatter and rims that are rounder. And flatter rims in general are going to be less comfortable. They're going to give you better articulations, but it takes a toll on your face. You get tired a little sooner. Whereas if you're playing on a nice round rim, feels like more cushion, and you can play longer. And it's great for slurs, but it might be a little bit more difficult to articulate. I like, and I think as a general rule, that funnel cup is really great on piston instruments, and the bowl-shaped cup is wonderful on rotary instruments. But there are people that play one on the other. There's not a 100% standard, but I think with beginners, that's a good rule to follow. I also think that even though I tend to play on a flatter, sharper rim, all of my students start on rounder rims because it's about making them comfortable and wanting to continue to play the instrument. And so I definitely put them on a more cushioned rim to start to help with that.
So let's focus for a moment on junior high students, and even late elementary school, maybe fifth grade if they start tuba in fifth grade through eighth grade. As a former ed rep and as a tuba player, what was kind of your go-to setup to recommend to a band director for that younger player?
Yeah, I recommend looking at a 3/4 instrument. And there's a couple of different models because as they become more advanced, I would want them to have a fourth valve because they're getting to that point where intonation is more important. Not that it's not ever important. But as the bands are getting better, then it's time for them to learn how to use that fourth valve. But I always look at the size of the student, and I think that's one of the mistakes that I see the most. I think we've all, as ed reps, walked into band rooms and seeing these giant tubas with the valves up top and the instruments bigger than the student. So I'm 6'5", and a lot of these instruments that I would find in junior highs were not comfortable for me to play. But for years, they've been the standards. And they're really rugged and they hold up well. And so people buy them. And so that is actually one of the harder conversations sometimes to have with a band director when you're an ed rep, is when they're asking for a tuba and that it's not the right size instrument or the right instrument for the group. And that's never an easy conversation. And a lot of that depends on your relationship with that teacher. So it's good. That's why you want to build those strong relationships. But yeah, I always would point those things out about how size really does matter in this situation. And there are always extenuating circumstances that come into it. Like, hey, well, we already have a bunch of these and I need to add one more. I don't want to get a smaller instrument with the bell pointing the other way. And from a logistical standpoint, that makes sense. But if we're starting anew and there's no concerns like that you're working with, yeah, I always try to get the right size instrument into the hands of the students playing them.
So I think it would be useful to kind of look at the two groups of ages that ed reps work with the most, junior highs / middle schools and high schools. And I'd like to get really specific with a couple of your favorite models. I know you must feel like a parent to all of your tuba children that you've created, all these different models at Eastman. And I know you're not supposed to ask parents what their favorites are, but let's do that. Let's look at maybe 2 models for junior high and 2 models for high school and why. So let's start with junior high. What would you recommend to a junior high band director from the Eastman model lineup?
Sure. So the first instrument that I'm going to recommend is our EBB226. This is a 3-quarter instrument that has 4 piston valves. And it's the valve section that's actually off of the other instrument that I would recommend, which is our EBB534. So it not only gives that smaller instrument the 4th valve, which I think is very important for kids to start learning on at a younger age, but it also gives it a slightly larger bore size. It's not a huge difference, but it does jump enough that you have to put more air through the instrument. It's one of the other things that tubas, like they said, we get bigger in size and they get bigger in bore. On the trumpet, that's not going to be the case when you're going from the 4th to 5th to 6th to 7th grade to 10th grade. It's going to be most likely a 459 bore instrument. The instrument's going to look the same. But on tuba, if you could imagine going from a really small instrument with a really small bore to all of a sudden you've got a big instrument that's got a big bore, well, now you've got 2 new sets of obstacles to overcome at once. So that's why I like that 226 as that in-between instrument. I think it's a real true intermediate tuba.
Okay. Well, what grades would you put that 226 model in?
Sure. I more so than grades, I would say, right, if we're going to talk grades, I would say 6th grade, 7th, 8th grade, depending on the size of the student. But okay. I think it's as long as the students had a couple of years under their belt is kind of the idea, because you want to get them the fundamentals and get them some time putting air through the horn. And then as they grow, 6th grade and 7th grade is a wonderful place to put that, and even into 8th grade.
Okay.
And then the 534 is the other option that I like, and that's a 4-quarter tuba in our catalog, but it's really compactly wrapped. And so it has a 20-inch bell. The bore size on it is 689, which isn't that large. So it's an instrument that the younger kids can still put air through and fill up. And then the taper of the bell does a lot of the work for getting the size of sound that you want. But because it is wrapped into a smaller, tighter body, you can put that in the hands of somebody that's 5 feet tall. You don't have to be 6 foot tall to play that instrument.
Even though it's a full size.
Even though it's a full size instrument. Yeah, that's where we get back to with fractional size instruments. There's a lot of things to take into consideration. So those are my 2 favorites if we're looking at the middle school group. If we're looking at elementary school, the 234 is my preference. One thing I would like to share with ed reps, it has been my personal goal to get teachers to start kids with valves that are front action.
Why is that?
So it's ergonomics and also just where we end up as we progress. Most tuba players are going to end up on a front action instrument, whether it's piston or rotary valves. Also, most tuba players, kids when they start, are not big enough to reach the lead pipe when they're sitting on a chair. So they are going to be turning the tuba to one side or another. If the tuba has front action valves, they're reaching over the horn, and it's very similar to how they would play, hand position, how they would if the horn was standing upright. If you have top action valves and you turn it to the side, well, now if you just imagine where your hand is and the hand position you're in playing-wise, it's not ergonomically correct, and they usually have to tilt their head to get to the lead pipe at that point because it's a little bit lower that way. So that is the reason that I like it. I like it better. And then it also it really helps when you're setting up your stage for your band later on to where your tuba bells can point out into the audience or up into the back of the auditorium, depending on how you want it set up and how strong of players they are.
Okay. Excellent. And what about for that high school that they just have to have rotors?
If they've got to have rotors, the EBB562. I love that tuba, and I will tell you that there are multiple professional players that are playing it when they need to play rotary B-flat tuba in an orchestra, and I'm one of them. And we're building a version of that that's got a fifth valve and a slightly bigger bell flare for people like me. But that's how good that instrument is. It plays so great, and it doesn't have the biggest bore out there. Like if you look at it compared to the other instruments on the market that people go to when they're looking at rotors, the bore size is actually smaller. But again, we have the size of instrument and the taper of the bell is bigger. And so the horn does a lot of the work for you when it comes to getting the size and color of sound that you want.
I'm sure you've been in many, many band rooms in your lifetime as an ed rep and currently as a product manager for tubas. What's the most common mistake you see, or something that you see it and you just think, oh, they could do better if they had this instead?
Sure. So for junior highs, I think we touched one. It's not having an instrument that's the right size. It's always too big. Very rarely do you see students on smaller instruments, and that was equally as damaging. They can't put the air through it because it was designed for a smaller kid, so they're not able to fill it up. They're not learning how to play properly. You have those issues as well. So size is number one. Number two, I think band directors, because tubas are expensive and it's an instrument that they have to provide most of the time. Students aren't coming to them owning their own tubas after playing for a year or two. So I don't think band directors switch their students over to 4-valve instruments soon enough. I think that's something that I see a lot. I think in the past, it was mostly because we didn't make instruments that were the right size with 4 valves. And now we do. And the reason I bring this up, as a ed rep, when you're out there listening, next time you're in a band room that has tubas with 4 valves, watch the kids play and see how many of them actually use it. The longer they go just using 3-valve instruments, they don't learn how to use that 4th valve, and they don't learn how to correct the intonation and extend the range. And so it's just a habit that gets harder to get out of.
Well, what you said a moment ago, I think is so important to be able to have a conversation with a band director and try to actually bring them over to maybe a different idea than what the band director has. In the context of talking about tubas, what kind of questions should an ed rep be asking a band director who says, hey, I need a new tuba for my junior high. Will you get me a bid?
Sure. I think there are a couple of questions that you need to ask. First is, I think you need to qualify it more. What age group are we looking at? Are we looking at 8th graders in junior high, or are we looking at 6th graders? Because that's going to determine the size of instrument that you're buying probably. The other thing I would ask, are you looking for rotary valves or are you looking for piston valves? And I think a lot of times when I was a road rep, the band director would come to me and say, this is what I'm looking to get. And from there, I would then formulate questions. Like if a band director came to me and said, I want to buy this instrument, it's got 4 rotary valves, and I know that they have no idea how to maintain rotary valves, and they have $150 a year repair budget, I'm probably going to try and talk them out of rotary valves because of the added upkeep and maintenance that goes along with them. More moving parts means more things that can break, and tubas are just large. You walk through a door frame and you can bang them and things get damaged. So that's something that I would take into account. As far as the sizing part, yeah, that's more specific. What age group are you looking for? How tall are these kids? You've got to break it down that much. And then a lot of times band directors that just go, well, I want to get this so it's something that they can grow into, and we can put them on a tuba stand for now, or they can hold it sideways. And for that, sure, they can. That's how I learned. And I really liked playing tuba. But for kids that aren't really, really into it, you're just giving them reasons to quit because it's uncomfortable for them to play an instrument like that.
So is there anything else that you would like to get out there to the ed rep world that you think would be really useful for them in terms of tubas or helping teachers pick tubas?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is don't just be an order taker. I think find out exactly what they're using it for and what their needs are. And then that way, with the information that I've given you and what's available, and probably most of the stuff you knew already, you'll be able to guide them to what they actually need. And in the long run, the kids are going to be happier with it, and then the teachers are going to be happier with it, and the bands are going to sound better. And they're going to be thankful that you took the time to have that instead of just having a teacher go, I want this because I went to school in 1985, and when I graduated, this is what people bought. If you can actually update them and get them information and put them into the right instrument that's going to make their band sound better, they're really going to appreciate that and come to rely on you for more things.
Great advice, Chuck. What would you recommend to someone who's trying to bring a new brand like Eastman into a school district, and they're trying to get acceptance for this? How would you go about that?
So first thing I would say is don't be shy about trying it, because they do have to purchase it, and they're always looking for something that plays that's at a better price point. With our instruments specifically, here's the thing that I tell everybody, and some people go, oh, well, you're just a sales guy and you work for the company and you're a mouthpiece, but this is the truth. We make instruments that the best tuba players in the world play in the best concert halls that there are, and we make for beginners. And what we do with materials and as far as how we hone valves to make sure that they work properly and all of the stuff that goes into the build itself, we use that on all of our levels of instruments. It's what I tell people is, as a manufacturer, you want to have as few processes and as few different materials as possible. You want to be able to do the same thing for as many different products as you can, just so that you can do things quickly. So for us, we've decided to take our highest level instrument and make every instrument that way. And so I would also say, don't be ashamed about it, because our tubas are literally the best tubas in that price point on the market, and not even the price point in the category. I would say there's not a 3/4 tuba that plays better. A 3/4 4-valve instrument, it's tremendous. Our 4/4 piston and rotary tubas, there are professionals that play them in the top 40 orchestras in this country, and they're using the same instruments that high schools are playing because it's a great instrument. They don't have to worry about the value, but it happens to be a great value also. So yeah, I don't know if you can tell, I can't say enough great things about what we're doing. And honestly, coming from a world where I played at a high level and these people are my colleagues, I wouldn't put my name on it if I didn't feel that way.
I can tell, like you said a moment ago, you sound like a proud parent, and the things you've done to create an amazing line of so many different tubas is really remarkable, Chuck. And every time I talk to you, I learn something new, and I hope everybody out there did as well. And Chuck's really an amazing resource, and we'll make sure that he's reachable to people listening if you have any questions.
Yes, please feel free. Anybody reach out. As you can tell, I love talking tuba, and I'll just leave you with, wait till you see our sousaphone.
Well, it sounds like we'll have more to talk about on another episode. Chuck, thanks so much for your time today.
Have a good day, Shane.
We hope you found the information in this episode useful and something you can use in your everyday life as an ed rep. If there is a topic you'd like to learn more about and have presented on a future episode of Ed Rep Radio, or you'd like to give us some feedback in general, please email us at edrepradio@eastmanstrings.com. To learn more about Eastman Music Company, go to our website.